Hi, my name is Dara Udo. I am an acute care physician. I also have an MPH in global public health from the Harvard School of Public Health, and I'm absolutely delighted today to be presenting this session as an interview and discussion with Drs. Michael Callahan and Mark Poznansky on next generation COVID vaccines. To quote a recent op-ed co-authored by Drs. Callahan and Poznansky concerning COVID and recent vaccines, the response has really been reactive and not proactive. The virus emerged, the DNA was sequenced, and vaccines were expeditiously made and put to use. However, this is not a strategy that considers how to prevent variants or further waves of different vaccines. The virus is evolving and various variants are emerging, and we need to think about ways that we can be proactive instead of reactive moving forward. I'm going to give very brief introductions to both Drs. Callahan and Poznansky, just in the interest of time. Both their credentials, accolades, and everything else could take up an entire hour in and of itself, but I just want to briefly introduce the both of them. Dr. Michael Callahan, he is a physician scientist and he specializes in internal medicine, infectious diseases, and tropical medicine. He's also credentialed in mass casualty care and rescue medicine. He has clinical appointments at MGH, Harvard Medical School, and has had professorships in Thailand, Nigeria, and Panama, and has worked in various hospitals and institutions around the world. Dr. Mark Poznansky is also a physician scientist. He specializes in internal medicine as well as infectious diseases. He is the current director of the Vaccine and Immunotherapy Center and CEO and founder of COVID Recovery. He is associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and attending physician of infectious diseases at Massachusetts General Hospital. So without further delay, we're going to get right into it. Dr. Callahan, can you walk us through the basics of the current process of vaccine development?
Yes, traditionally, vaccines are generated by taking either the dead organisms or just a part of the organism and transforming that into either an injectable or something that you would eat that would mimic an infection but without the disease. So it would sort of spoof the human body's immune system to make either antibodies or lymphocytes or other cells that would help to protect you, but again, without the disease. What's really different this time around is the first time brand new technologies have been brought to vaccinology, to making vaccines, where we actually print genes in the laboratory, and those genes direct your own body to make the proteins of a virus that your body has never even seen before. These are the mRNA vaccines, and right behind them are the DNA vaccines.
Fascinating. And I know a lot of people have definitely been concerned with the mRNA technology, but what you're really saying is we're just getting better at refining what parts we take to introduce in order to create a vaccine.
Correct. And the technology is really in its infancy. It is in its about 11th year in 2021. And we've been working to develop this technology for quite a long time. It's had a lot of failures along the way, but in the last 3 years, a couple of technologies came together that made it really viable, that made it really useful. And of course, its big coming out party was the pandemic for COVID-19, where two companies really performed extraordinarily. It was really a remarkable achievement.
Exactly, and really amazing. So it's been in development for many, many years, but it just really came out very quickly from COVID specifically. So Dr. Poznansky, what do you see as the main issues with how vaccines are currently being developed and sent and made and then put out on the market?
Well, there are two things here. Is obviously we needed vaccines that could react rapidly to the presence of a growing pandemic across the planet. And therefore, the technologies that Michael was talking about really met that need, which was, you needed vaccines as quickly as possible. And it turned out there was a technology that hadn't been previously used in this way that was sort of potentially utilizable in this particular context. So, however, those are really reactive vaccine development type of steps. And that also started at a time when we were aware that variants of the viruses would emerge. And that's where we need a completely different type of vaccine platform to be more proactive, to finish off the virus rather than giving it ways out and become adapted to our immune systems, adapted to the vaccines, and then escape from those aspects of our response to the infectious disease.
Okay, interesting. So you mentioned being proactive. What are some ways that we can think about creating vaccines that are proactive instead of reactive? Dr. Callahan, I know you've worked with many different institutions across the world, and this is specifically some of the things that you tackle. Are there any things that you think would help us to develop proactive vaccinations instead of reactive vaccinations, which is what we've kind of been doing?
It's only in recent years that we've been able to discuss really the true power of these vaccines. As an actual example, the federal government has received sequences from viruses that have never left foreign soil. They're from Indonesia, China, or Russia, and they were sent to the US, and they were turned around into vaccines here in the US by taking the sequences, producing the proteins that those viruses would make in actual diseases, and then shipping the protein back to these countries where it would be used to prove you can make people and animals immune. And why is that a big deal? Because the next step, the next demonstration project, was to do the same thing, but with a virus of the future. It was an inbound virus. It hadn't appeared yet, but it was inevitable. So in this case, we just adapted it to the trend of viral evolution and produced for the first time a vaccine before that pathogen had even emerged, and then sent that over to Indonesia where it was used in a study. So we sit really at a brand new era of vaccinology where we're not reacting to today's viruses, but actually creating capabilities for inbound threats that haven't appeared as disease-causing organisms yet.
Yeah, and I think I just want to add that, I mean, this is sort of we're all learning about this science as if it was invented today, but actually Dr. Callahan has been involved in spurring that type of proactive vaccine development for actually quite a long time, and it is now ready to meet the challenge in a sense, which I think that is out there given the emergence of the variants and the fact that those variants will continue to emerge unless we completely close down the pandemic.
And the implications for global health are really huge. Just think that if you can prepare vaccines over more reasonable timelines before these pathogens occur, rather than under desperate timelines when you're trying to react to a massive outbreak. So it's a huge it's a game changer, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit more about these collaborative efforts, because we are definitely living in a global world, and things that may emerge on in a different country, in a different lab, that information needs to be communicated, just as you referenced, over to the US so we can start sequencing and getting ahead of it. What systems are in place currently and need to be emphasized moving forward in order to continue those collaborations so that we can be communicating constantly with things that may be a threat in the future?
Sure. Historically, our experiences through the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s was that Western nations would take virus information or disease information from low and middle income nations and turning it into products for our traveling military, for the civilian travel community, and rarely would those life-saving products be transported back into regional economies and be brought to the rural and the urban poor of low and middle income nations. What's different now is these programs are just, equitable, transparent, and inherently collaborative from the get-go. So many of the vaccines that are available for COVID-19, as an example, were designed from the beginning with a target product profile that would allow them to be given in very austere and under-resourced countries. That's a transformative change. My favorite, for example, would be like the AstraZeneca vaccine. It runs with the cost of goods internationally, $3 a shot, 2 doses, but it can be stored with the same requirements as a cold can of Coca-Cola. We can give that anywhere on the planet. So again, transformative, equitable, diverse, safe, low cost, and easy to administer vaccines. That's the only way we're going to end these pandemics.
Yeah, could I just want to add in another point, which I know Michael's strong on, which is that this all demands tremendous international cooperation to achieve, what is needed here. And the truth of that is that has to be rebuilt. That type of nation-to-nation cooperation, nation-to-nation agreements that allow us to work together across borders to make these types of applications of the next generation of vaccines possible. And that's separate from just designing the vaccines. You need to have those international agreements back in place that allow that to happen.
Agreed. And in your recent op-ed, you referenced the Prophecy project that you've been working on. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Dr. Callahan?
Sure. We were quite alarmed back in about 2005 and 2006 by seeing bird flu patients in Indonesia working with poultry. They would get a type of flu. It's called H5N1. It's one of the first of the more recent life-threatening bird flus, and would produce basically a 40% case fatality rate in humans. 4 out of 10 patients that got this disease would die despite some pretty good medical care in the most advanced hospitals in Southeast Asia. When we saw those patients at bedside, we were quite concerned about human-to-human transmission. So we developed a system that had bidirectional value to all participants. It was developed by an agency in the U.S. Department of Defense called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, known better for inventing the internet, but also responsible for Mrna, an mRNA company that's done quite well. Prophecy realized that you need genetic intelligence and you need clinical intelligence in order to give yourself time to develop emergency vaccines. So stated plainly, we worked with white coat diplomacy, physicians in Boston, working with physicians in Indonesia and many other pretty difficult countries, and we assured them of providing them with therapies both here and now, and also to be entitled to the therapies of the future. What we got with that leveling of the playing field was extraordinary access to the patients, an opportunity to learn alongside our international colleagues, and the opportunity to bring these therapies to bear where they're needed most in these lower and middle income nations. So it was a pretty extraordinary program that gave rise to 3 follow-on programs, both inside the US government and by NGOs like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Medicine Sans Frontier, and the Wellcome Trust. So this is a real game changer for us internationally.
That's absolutely phenomenal. That's wonderful. Dr. Poznansky, I know over at the Vaccine Immunotherapy Center, there are several innovations in place to kind of help expedite scientific and academic discoveries to technologies and medications, especially vaccinations, for multiple different uses. What innovations are currently occurring out of the VIC lab related to COVID and the next generation of vaccines?
Well, the one that was actually funded through DARPA was the development of a rapid pandemic virus vaccine platform, which we called Vaccelerate, which is a relatively simple recombinant protein-based vaccine with that assembles with targeting proteins that are associated with the virus itself. You can make it very quickly. It's very easy to store. It's extremely stable, like these other vaccines that are like the AstraZeneca can be stored in the same fridge you use for your Coca-Cola. And the truth is that sort of the time came to when this platform was ready, and fortunately we were able to pair up with a company that were interested in taking our technology all the way to first in human. And currently we're in what's called proof of concept studies in animal models to show that our vaccine works. And after that, potentially by the end of this year would be into first in human phase 1 studies. So I think the focus that we had at the center was, here's an unmet need and we have a platform ready to go. And fortunately, we've been supported by the Department of Defense up until that point. And then a company stepped in and said, we'll take it all the way to support you and partner you to take it into first in human studies. So that's very much a VIC model, or a Vaccine and Immunotherapy Center model, which is move as fast as you can and partner with industry.
Absolutely. Partnerships and expeditious vaccines are very important, especially with what we've seen with COVID and the mortality and morbidity that's been associated with it. So Dr. Callahan, I am really just fascinated by the collaborations and the different things that you've been able to see and do around the world. Are there any lessons that we need to learn from what you've been able to do in the US in order to move forward in a way that makes sense for vaccine development and therapeutics in the future?
Sure, we need to just be mindful that innovation is everywhere, and different research cultures can produce new workarounds for problems that can then be re-imported here into the United States and into Western vaccine research and biologic development. So, for example, some of the most novel therapies that we have found for highly pathogenic influenza come from the countries most at risk of that same disease. And that would be China, who politically can create some problems for past and current administrations, but it is in our own best interest to engage their most advanced facilities and their well-funded and well-trained biotechnology community, from which we can derive mutually beneficial assets and assist them, perhaps, in bringing a meaningful Chinese antiviral to American markets for the good of everybody. So too are there many middle-income players and NGOs that are really doing extraordinary work, such as CEPI, the massive investment in making vaccine equity available to all parties, and even some other countries that have been out on the edges for a while. For this, I'll choose Russia as a great example. Whatever political difficulties we might have working with Russia, the manufacturers and inventors of the Sputnik vaccine, called the Gamaleya Institute, thought at the very beginning of how to make that vaccine endure against the variants and to prevent their own basically demise by having a human immune response to the virus that carries the gene for the COVID virus. So they brought an important lesson to us that we're now replicating to keep our own coronavirus vaccines relevant. So we need to have a lot of humility and understanding that smart ideas are everywhere, and we need to think about who's most at risk and double down to make sure that they are highly prioritized on the order in which these that life-saving and economy-saving vaccines are made available.
Agreed, absolutely. Dr. Poznansky, and I know, Dr. Callahan, you just referenced the influenza vaccine. That's one viral infection that we do have a vaccine that we use every year for. A lot of companies are currently working on boosters and new vaccines. Do you feel that moving forward, developing boosters and new vaccines for COVID every year is something that we should be focusing on? And is that something that's going to be our reality for time to come?
So I think that, you know, there's got to be a twin effort here. One is to keep as far ahead of the pandemic as one possibly can and keep it under some sort of control with boosters as needed. But in the end, we will need definitive sort of pan-coronavirus type vaccines, or as Michael was suggesting, vaccines that sort of pin the virus down into a dead end where it can't actually escape by mutating, you know, and I think those, you have to have the sort of short-term goal of, as I said, keeping that wave of pandemic under some sort of control, at the same time of looking further ahead with the next generation of vaccines that actually finish off the COVID-19 pandemic for good. Because frankly, at the moment, while we might sit back in certain countries, whether it's Israel or certain states in the US, and say, well, we've reached actually very high levels of vaccination, the failure to control a pandemic anywhere in the world is a failure to contain it everywhere. And so consequently, our eyes always have to be beyond the horizon, both in time and also geographically, to make sure that we realize the goal is to stop this disease across the world and not just locally.
Yes, I think that definitely makes sense, and that's really where the focus needs to be. So Dr. Callahan, this is a little bit of a controversial question, and there's a lot of talk about it, whether having seen, dealt with COVID and numerous other viral infections across the world, do you feel that COVID was spun from a virus that was developed organically, or something that was man-made and maybe accidentally spilled or escaped from a lab?
There's opinions and evidence-based analytics, which will allow us to probably get to that answer. The amount of forensic tools that we have to unwind the origin of COVID-19 is quite vast. What we will tell you is that, there is a remarkable, this virus, COVID-19, was really good with the first people that it infected. And that's unusual for a spillover virus. It is very routine that groups that are trying to develop life-saving products will actually test them against more sinister and more dangerous viruses. So the so-called gain of function really means the gain of virulence to allow those viruses to better infect people. That gives you a better target to go after, okay, is the more dangerous viruses. So when these viruses are produced in laboratories the world over, West and East, it is usually for beneficent reasons. It's to develop more powerful medications, vaccines, and drugs both. The trouble is this, when those viruses get out, they do not need to undergo much evolution. And in actual experiences of other gain-of-function infections, the people that are infected by a gain-of-function pathogen in a laboratory exposure can be quite grievously ill compared to that virus's cousin, which is still out there in nature. And what we see with gain-of-function experiences is those outbreaks tend to take off faster, okay, than what a virus that just spilled over from an animal and is just learning its way, is how to infect, evolve, and adapt to human populations and for human-to-human transmission. So our last point about vaccines is that it really doesn't matter where the origin of the virus is, whether it's a spillover from Mother Nature and a virus that's struggling to become very successful and very dangerous to global health, or if it's one that escapes from a facility and is instantly good at spreading among global populations. In both cases, we have to hit the ground running. But when we build vaccines to protect us against laboratory breaches, that vaccine manufacturing process has to occur in hours and days, not weeks and months.
So Dr. Poznansky, interesting enough. So we, referring to Homeland Security, we're very concerned about physical, chemical, and even now technological warfare, where other countries can threaten our welfare and economic and otherwise well-being. Should we also be equally as concerned about biological warfare with development of vaccines, as well development of infectious diseases such as COVID that could definitely devastate a country? Is that something we need to be concerned about, other hostile countries sending this way? And should we be focusing more on developing tools to combat that through Homeland Security? So
I'm not a biodefense expert. I would just say that the two mechanisms that are out there currently, which is natural evolution of a virus to spread around the globe, or through these gain of function type studies that are being done for scientific reasons to develop better therapeutics and potentially even better vaccines at some point, are quite enough at this point. I think the bottom line is it is a matter of concern for departments of defense all over the world that someone might release a bioweapon of some sort. And in fact, some of the platforms we've described already would be equally applicable to a biodefense threat as they would to a natural occurring pandemic threat. So there's sort of equal application of the technologies that we've talked about to those things. I think that, we actually have all of the resources and knowledge to approach either of those challenges. It's just the determination that we should, and the application of funding to make that happen.
Dr. Callahan, any other thoughts as far as what we should be doing now in order to kind of prevent these catastrophic events, either spill over from labs or occurring organically? What should we be doing now? What mechanisms can we put in place in order to prevent this happening in the future?
Sure. Obviously, we've talked a lot about global cooperation. What we need to twin that with is global incentives, to tie our futures together, because there's no, as Mark had said earlier, a viral outbreak anywhere with modern air travel and visiting friends and relatives and porous borders and commodities and exchange, that's a problem for everybody. My second proposition is that with the advent of these modern technologies, only one is self-replicating. Nuclear weapons do not beget more nuclear weapons. Chemical weapons facilities need infrastructure to support their manufacture, purification, refinement, storage, and munition loading. But biological weapons need very little of these things. You need a replicating organism and a facility to do that. That technology is so widely available because of healthcare and a global community that needs to make veterinary medicines to save our food animals and our crops, and obviously our vaccine industry and our biologics industry. So the time has never been so critical where we need to make sure that the capabilities of these incredibly high consequence assets are used only for good. So you've never been able to have so powerful a technology been so widely distributed and available to so few people. So it really requires the best of our treaties, the best of our cultural acceptance, our societal norms, our integration of religion and other beliefs. That's all part of it to dissuade small groups from embarking on this terrible, terrible capability.
Definitely. Agreed on multiple fronts. Mark, anything you'd like to add on to that?
No, I think that says it all. I think that society has to advance, and our global, it's sort of this test of the global society, and there are obviously these countervailing forces, to one on the nationalistic side and one on the globalization side, and that balance seems hard to achieve. But if you look at thousands of years of history, we are advancing in that regard. And before the pandemic, basically our societies were fueled by globalization and the forces of economies collaborating with all of the economies. And we saw how far we had advanced, because when COVID shut it down, we no longer saw planes flying in the sky. That's how dramatic the change was. So that was also a time to reflect on how far we've gone and come, and how far we still have to go given the types of challenges we're up against.
Thank you so much, Dr. Callahan and Dr. Poznansky, for this really insightful, forward-thinking and informative session. And we hope that this information will be heard and disseminated, so that moving forward we can all learn ways to help avoid the devastating, catastrophic events that have happened through COVID. Thank you so very much.
Thank
Be
you.
well.